Being a leader in the early Christian church was a dangerous profession. It was not a job, it was a passionate calling. Before writing Thessalonians, Paul had fled for Athens from Berean persecution. Silas and Timothy had stayed in Berea. Paul later moved on to Corinth and was joined by Silas and Timothy. It was while in Corinth that Paul wrote the first epistles to the Thessalonian church. Thessalonica was a bustling seaport city at the head of the Thermaic Gulf, the largest city in Macedonia and the provincial capital. It was an important commercial and trade center. Now let's get a little background. The Thessalonican church was largely Gentile in membership. Paul had been there and left Thessalonica abruptly after a rather brief stay. Thus, the recent converts from paganism were left with little external support while they were facing persecution. So as Paul sits down to write this letter, his purpose is to encourage these new converts during their trials, to give instructions about godly living, and to give them some assurances concerning the future of believers who die before the return of Christ. Now, if you look at the construction of Paul's epistles, in virtually every one of them except Galatians, he begins by thanking his readers. Paul was pleased with the progress of the Thessalonian church. It had become an example, so he continued to give thanks to God for them. Paul not only wanted the church to know that they were a part of his thoughts and prayers, he wanted them to know specifically why they were important to him and the ministry. If you look at this, Paul didn't just say good job. Paul gave a rather detailed compliment, indicating that the Thessalonian church without ceasing demonstrated works of faith in their past deeds. They had labors promoted by love in their current works, and they had endurance inspired by hope to describe their future works, which was based on their belief in the return of Jesus Christ. As leaders at home, at church, at work, we must give specific compliments so that people know what they are doing right. If you look at Paul's writing, he is confident about the survival of this church and rather fond of them. He refers to these Christians affectionately as brothers and sisters. In the midst of the persecution that they were suffering, Paul does not go into a pity party or even urge them to seek revenge on those persecuting them. Paul recognizes that the true source of this church's power, the source of our power today, is God. So he writes, since you are loved by God, since you have been selected to have the new relationship with God, Paul wants them to know that salvation is God's choice of us, but your works are inspired by God. Paul is confident in the Thessalonian church because of the vibrant way the message was received in Thessalonica during his missionary journey. Referring to the recipients and the way the Holy Spirit had manifested himself amongst believers, Paul writes, some have claimed the word with power and with full assurances, able to recognize the power of God acting and moving in their lives. Paul's confidence in this church is built on the same things that we should expect of our churches today. He says that the word in Thessalonica is living, it is active, it is powerful, able to bring men into a saving relationship with God. The Thessalonians embraced the word with a full conviction in such a way that it pointed people to their faith and confidence in God and in the missionaries that God had sent them. The zealous embrace of the Christians at Thessalonica spoke to the zeal at which they embraced the teachings of these missionaries. It reassured Paul, as we all need reassurance sometimes, that our work is not in vain, that our words and our works will indeed change lives and make the world and make people better, so long as we put God first. So what makes the Thessalonians so different from other churches? Is it an example that we can use today? How did the gospel change the lives of the Thessalonians? Well, let's look at that. They received the message with the joy of the Holy Spirit and were saved even in the midst of affliction and persecution. They became imitators of Paul and also the Lord. Now, that tells us that we must watch the examples that we set as we do our daily lives and serve as missionaries. We should always seek to be and show the world what God would look like doing the things that we do. The Bible tells us that the Thessalonians developed so much that they became examples to other believers in Macedonia and in the surrounding area. Their testimony was such that they developed witnesses in every place. The Thessalonians inspire modern churches not to sit still waiting for people to come, but to actively spread the word with exuberance. Just as we tell friends about a great restaurant, and the ministry of our churches must be so inspiring to us that we discuss those ministries around the water cooler or over lunch. The Thessalonians were an example of an inspiring church. They had repented, turning from their former source of trust and turning to God as their salvation. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week.